So today I just wanted to take a look at the 1996 horror film From Dusk Till Dawn, obviously directed by Robert Rodriguez and the screenplay written by Quentin Tarantino. For me, this film was a very big part of my youth. I had never seen anything this pulpy before, so to me it just really stood out. It was just one of those things that I was thinking to myself at the time, I need more of this. I want more stuff that's like this, and I thought it was absolutely awesome. Of course, by this point in time, I was familiar with Quentin Tarantino, which was the main reason, obviously, also why I wanted to see this film, because he was in it. I had not yet fully familiarized myself with Robert Rodriguez. I had seen Desperado, so I knew the name. Of course, these two people came together, and this whole thing was just total wow. You know, definitely, I guess you could say, knocked my shoes off, essentially, in my youth. But I definitely love, obviously, the writing, the directing. I think they work very well together. Obviously, obviously the very typical profane, rich dialogue is very Quentin Tarantino, but I love his use of language because it comes from a total left field angle at times, but it also still feels very realistic. So it has a normal or natural language pattern flow to it. Obviously, Robert Rodriguez definitely adds to this with his unique directing style. Obviously, I guess you could say his more signature overhead or under or worm's eye view type directing. But I especially love the opening sequence where you have the truck. It's driving down the highway. Actually, it's a car, but they're driving down the highway, and we've got like this little insert of a woman inside the trunk, and she's begging for help. And obviously, if they hadn't included that insert, we would not have known that this woman was there. And to me, it's kind of like, oh wow, you know, it further cements, you know, just how bad these Gecko brothers are, especially that one scene at Benny's World of Blood, which is just, you know, absolutely just balls out awesome. You know, it just escalates from bad to worse very quickly. But it's very much one of those things where it keeps you gripped. You want to continue to watch, and you want to see what's going to go on, even though obviously we know Richard Gecko is a little off his rocker, but it definitely one of those scenes that really sets the tone and pace for the film as far as what to expect throughout the feature. So I really love, once again, the writing, great acting as well. Juliette Lewis does an excellent job in this herself, and of course you have Harvey Keitel. And of course you do have the more obvious references, of course, in the bar scene once the vampires have let loose. You know, one of the guys, I believe it's one of the biker guys, he's saying, you know, just tie two sticks together or something like that to form a crucifix. Someone else states, oh yeah, Peter Cushing does that. Obviously Peter Cushing, who played Van Helsing in the Hammer pictures. Of course, you also have Santanico Pandemonium, which her name is a very obvious reference to a Latsploitation film. I eventually would love to take a look at that film. I still have yet to see it. But if it were not for her name, I wouldn't even know that such a film even existed. So I love the cross pulp cultural references throughout this entire film. There are various back and forth references between Robert Rodriguez's films as well as Quentin Tarantino. You've got the pistol cod piece that is worn by Sex Machine. If I remember correctly, that is a reference to Desperado. You even have the bit of dialogue spoken by Seth Gecko, the one scene in which he says, "Ramblers, let's get rambling," which references Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. Yes, I know I'm jumping all over the place. I apologize. I'm working with the assumption that the majority of you have seen this film, but let me slow myself down and take it from the top here really quick. So obviously you've got these bank robbers. They are trying to cross the border into Mexico. You've got Richard and Seth Gecko. Seth obviously being the more level-headed brother, and Richard just, you know, being a few bottles short of a six-pack. But he definitely has his own issues going on, especially when he's left alone with the lady hostage, which, you know, the background scene is very graphic when Seth sees what had happened to this poor woman. We get very brief glimpses, very gory glimpses, but we don't actually see what happened. You know, and for some reason this scene, I haven't seen anything reference this in the commentary or documented anywhere, so it could just be me, but to me it feels like it's a reference to cat people. There's a scene in which Malcolm McDowell, in panther form or cat form, disembowels a woman that he picked up at a cemetery, and it's also just very, I guess you could say, graphic in itself, but it doesn't have too much detail. So I honestly don't know if that's a reference to the Cat People film, but to me it kind of feels like it is. So you've got these guys that are trying to make their way across the border. They take a family hostage, I guess you could say, a minister or a preacher, played by Harvey Keitel. You have his, I guess you could say, rambunctious daughter, played by Juliette Lewis. They are essentially taken hostage at a motel that the two groups happen to stop at. They were obviously singled out because they are traveling in an RV, and the geckos assumed that it would just be easier to cross the border in such a vehicle. So they essentially do worm their way onto the RV. They make it across the Mexican border. And what I find very interesting here is the fact that Cheech Marin has a reoccurring role throughout the film, which I find very fun, very enjoyable. I really don't see him too much around in film. Obviously, the majority of you may know him from Cheech and Chong, but you know, by this point in time, his heyday was long over. Tommy Chong had not yet achieved his resurgence on that 70s show, so it was just kind of like a nice, quick little, hello, hey, I remember you. But I definitely do love just the various parts that he plays throughout the film. So they make it to this bar, unbeknownst to them. It is run by vampires, not necessarily an original concept. If you have ever seen Grace Jones in Vamp, that is very much essentially the same thing. Strippers who also happen to be vampires. But, you know, I definitely love the character development. Everyone definitely has kind of like either their own backstory or their depth. So they're not, you know, cardboard flat characters. You know, they definitely have something there to hold the interest. And of course, those of you who do follow the works of Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez, it's kind of hard not to. I mean, most people that I know, if you love one, you love them both. You know, they're not necessarily an either-or person. But the character Earl McGraw very much pops up across various other films as well. So it's kind of like the whole Stephen King universe effect here, where you've got these cross-referencing stuff going on. So Earl McGraw also makes an appearance in Kill Bill, Planet Terror, Death Proof. So he's definitely got a fair amount of, I guess you could say, pop-up effect going on here. Obviously, we are all familiar with the ending of this film, of course. So roughly 3 years later, there was a direct-to-video release, a sequel from Dusk Till Dawn to Texas Blood Money. It's really not a bad movie. You do have another appearance by Danny Trejo. He is once again the vampire barkeep. You've also got the Liquid Terminator. I have never for the life of me learned that poor man's name. To me, he's just always going to be the Liquid Terminator. To me, they are the two standout actors in this film. But it's a basic plot. To my understanding, the events of this film are meant to take place roughly 2 to 3 weeks later after the events from the first film. So you've got an ex-con which has planned a bank heist. There really is no direct connection to the original film. So it's very much a standalone sequel. So he's got this bank heist. He's got his group of misfits that he has pulled together for this. But very early on in the film, we do have a cameo by Bruce Campbell and Tiffany Thiessen. They pretty much are attacked in an elevator full of bats. So of course, this one effect is the thing that caught my interest very early on. It gives me the impression that they were trying to some degree, mimic Robert Rodriguez's filming style. You've got kind of like this subjunctive view of the inside of the bat's mouth as it comes in to bite its victim. This is something that is repeated a few times, also with the bite being done in human form. You've also got the worm's eye view, as I call it. There's a scene in which the character Jesus pulls some beers out of a cooler. Obviously, it's just a glass tabletop that he is reaching into and pulls the cans of beer out of. But, it definitely is meant to give you just that varying angle or view. But to me, it's repeated perhaps maybe a little too frequently throughout the film. It very quickly becomes tiresome. I mean, the first time it's done, it's kind of like, oh, nice, that's kind of cool. It's kind of like a little nod. Just the fact that you've got this kind of POV vampire shot, action shot going on, it kind of to a degree reminds me of John Woo a little bit. Obviously, if you've ever seen his work in Bride of Chucky, that one scene where the Tiffany character is popping Chucky's eyeball back into the doll's head, kind of things like that. But obviously Chucky did not happen until a few years later, but to me it just feels very reminiscent. But it is a very basic plot. The one character that just kind of really bothered me was Jesus. He's playing kind of like this very stereotypical cholo, tough guy type character, but I don't know if it's just the way that he was asked to play the character in certain scenes, or if it was just all the actor himself, but it seems like he's trying too hard to be a tough guy. He comes off as a total caricature rather than a realistic portrayal of a personality type. While at the motel, basically where all of these hoods are meeting up because they are waiting on one last member before they go out to make their heist, I guess you could say. For some odd reason, they're all sitting around watching porn. So it's kind of like this whole, dude's pajama party going on. And there's this debate whether or not skin flicks with a plot are superior to skin flicks minus the plot, because the end result is the same. You are watching it for the same obvious reason. So I found that just a bit humorous. At one point, obviously also just the odd reason. Why do you have a bunch of straight men watching porn together? I don't know. Maybe I'm just putting too much thought into that. But obviously this Jesus guy at some point in time gets up and he visits one of the women who happens to be running the motel. I wonder why. So they have their little liaison. As she's getting, or rather as she's getting herself cleaned up in the shower, she is attacked by a bat, which happens to be the guy that they are waiting on. They do not realize that he has been converted, but it's very much a homage to Psycho. You've got the close-up of the swirling blood down the drain. As the woman collapses, she pulls the shower curtain. You even got the overhead view of the shower head. So it's definitely very much a nod at Psycho. And I thought that was just an interesting touch there, the whole death by vampire bat. But, definitely kind of a cute little touch there. So they obviously make it to their bank job. One by one, the men start falling victim. They become vampires. And essentially, Mr. Liquid Terminator guy is the only remaining human. So eventually, at some point in time, he winds up siding with the cops that are trying to take what they assumed were normal bank robbers into justice. Obviously, this one guy is more interested in just saving himself. So, you know, very much a basic plot. It's not a bad film. I mean, it doesn't have terrible dialogue or anything like that, just some scenes which kind of, or rather the way a certain character is written, it just kind of leaves me a little bit like, well, you know, he's a little bit over the top. But for the most part, it is not a bad movie. So if you have never seen or heard of this, I would definitely recommend checking it out. So there was a second direct-to-video sequel titled From Dusk Till Dawn 3, The Hangman's Daughter. So this is very much a period piece set in the early 1900s. And essentially, it is the backstory of Santanico Pandemonium. So that alone makes it interesting to me just because I love that character. It also has the whole period piece aspect going for it. So definitely two reasons for loving this film. But obviously we've got this young woman named Esmeralda. She is the hangman's daughter. Her father is extremely strict and abusive with her. She does not know why. And it's during this scene that the guy who is to be publicly hung winds up being released. He takes her with him because he assumes that she, I guess you could say to some degree, could be used as a hostage. Unbeknownst to him, the father just doesn't give 2 cents worth about her. So along their travels, they kind of form their own little attachment to one another. We've also got just kind of somewhat of a misguided bandit wannabe, which kind of tags along, who gives them the idea of robbing a carriage. There is a man named Ambrose Bierce, yes, the American author. This is a fictionalized characterization of the author. Obviously, for those of you who are not in the know, he went to Mexico to join Pancho Villa in the revolution. He disappeared. No one ever heard from him. So they're also just kind of implying, you know, maybe this is why he disappeared and no one ever heard from him again. You know, potentially became a vampire snacky. But, you know, I definitely love the subplots going on with this film. They definitely do give you various things to hold your interest, but as I've stated, you kind of have like the whole love story subplot. They do make their way to the infamous vampire bar, which no one knows happens to be vampire run, but along the way we also discover that the head vampire, or the madam, happens to be the mother of Esmeralda. There really is no story between what happened between Esmeralda's father and her mother. I'm assuming he was just some schmuck that used to frequent the area, and when she came with child, he potentially may have just taken her to raise her as human. But of course, once entering the tavern or the bar, she now has the potential to become a vampire again. So the mother wants to groom her, and basically they refer to her as the princess. So she's, I guess you could say, part of this grand prophecy. But of course, this third installment very much reads off like the first one. You've got you know, kind of like these thieves, and they are holding up to take shelter in an area that they assumed would have been safe, which unfortunately is not. You also do have the appearance of Rebecca Greyheart, who is playing a missionary, I guess you could say. Her husband, who happens to be a total fraud and only married her for her wealth, also seems to reference Jacob, the faithless preacher from the first film. Obviously, the husband in this third installment is a charlatan, essentially himself being a faithless preacher because he does not care about the good word. But, You know, the action-y sequences in this film are not too bad. Obviously, it is a direct-to-video or a lower-budget film. A few things are a bit laughable, some things are kind of hokey, but for the most part, it is a very enjoyable film. If I had to put them in order, as far as like which films I prefer, obviously I would go with the original, then Hangman's Daughter and Texas Blood Money last. But definitely an enjoyable series to watch. The two direct-to-video sequels, I wouldn't necessarily call them time killer movies because they are actually rather good. You know, especially if you are very much into the vampire genre, they are definitely worth a look at, or even if you just love From Dusk Till Dawn. Obviously, Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez served as producers for the second and third installment, and to my knowledge, excuse me, to my knowledge, Danny Trejo is the only reoccurring actor across all three films. But I would definitely love to share some thoughts with you. Obviously, as I've stated, I really loved the original Dusk Till Dawn film. In my youth, when I found out that there were to be sequels, I was, you know, just over the moon and I wanted to watch them as well. But I would definitely love to share thoughts about these films with you, and I will talk to you guys later.